if you're an employer, if you're trying to get on board, a class of Gen Z leaders into your system,
Mm-hmm.
what do they need to keep in mind when you think about sort of attracting them, retaining them, developing them, and especially in the context of the fact that here is a young generation which is just entering the workforce. They're likely going to be in probably at least for the next 2.5 decades, sort of kind of
Right.
dominating, being the mainstream workforce. And so if you're an employer, or just strictly from a learning lens, right? What should they do? What's your
Yeah. So,
advice?
so that's a great question, and I'm just going to say that there are a lot of great experts out there who can help organizations understand and develop um, sort of marketing campaigns and uh, you know kind of campaigns to attract new hires and so on who are of Generation Z, and they will do a much better job than I would do of telling you what the steps are in that. I will just say this, that I think that it's always true that you want to meet people where they are, and the familiarity that Generation Z have with so many communications technologies and the tools that that they choose to use, I think that's where they are. And so my advice would simply be to investigate where do Generation Z live, and I'm using air quotes here to say that living isn't just about the physical world, it's about the virtual world as well. So where are they? And then and can you be there to interact with them in a way that is interesting, relevant, and causes them to take interest in your organization. And I would strongly suggest that you get some Generation Z people to help you develop that. So the last thing that we want is the what's called the creepy treehouse syndrome, where again, people of a much older age group are like trying to create a presence in a virtual space that really belongs to to Generation Z or others, right? It just feels creepy. So I would strongly suggest that you involve some Generation Z folk in the design and the execution of any outreach that you would want to have across any particular platforms. And I think that I think that the other thing is that as organizations, and here's what I do. Um, I have this target model that I use. Very simple idea. The target model is, and it's interestingly, it relates to your book, Nikhil, Targeting Gen Z. This target model has at the center a core, and in the core or in the bullseye are the tools that you use today that you're familiar with and that you use to deliver whatever the service or the product or the education or the whatever it is to your clientele or the people within your organization. And so you can think about that right in the center. Then on the outside of just one ring out from that is an experimentation ring, where you have chosen some new technologies to experiment with. This is really important. This is a step many organizations fail to see, is that there's a ring in which they should be experimenting with things, and experiments often don't result in something that you find very useful. So to the extent that you can, find a way to experiment. And the final concentric ring on the outside is the sensing ring. And how do you sense what's on the horizon that you might want to experiment with? If the experiment goes well, you might want to adopt into your core set of technologies. And this is an evergreen cycle of work that you can do. Now, how do you do that? You can, if you're a small organization, you can find some external partners. Maybe it's in a conference group, maybe it's some other kind of professional organization that you can find a little affinity group, and you can use some networking technologies to work that out yourself. Or if you're larger organizations, establish a working group whose job it is to sense what's out there on the horizon in terms of new technologies, choose some strategically to experiment with, form up those experiments around particular issues that will, particular real problems for the organization. And then if those go well, adopt them into the core. So for me, there's always this kind of target model that I have in mind. as I continue to evaluate new technologies, for example, artificial intelligence and difficult conversations. So I've been, in the process of experimenting with some of that myself to see would it really work to immerse people in a virtual reality space where they have an artificially intelligent driven conversation with an avatar. That's very cool stuff, but it's very experimental. Don't know if it's going to work out yet or not. So those are the kinds of things that I encourage people to do. And I've already talked about avoid the shiny object syndrome. And for me, that extends to don't overinvest in hardware. I counsel a lot of clients on the virtual reality front to be careful not to just go out and buy 800 of a particular device, because those devices are continually changing, just constantly changing. So be careful about over-investing in hardware. And the third thing I'd say is continue your own education. So conferences are where you can learn a lot. There's a lot of good tech conferences out there, whether you're in the learning space or other spaces. Avail yourself of the conferences and the many experts that are out there that are perhaps doing some of the hard work for you that you can learn from. So I wish you all great success on your journey to find the connections between the ever expanding universe of technologies and your Generation Z people, the ones that are important to you in your work.